Hi everyone, David here. So in our last discussion in the philosophy of language, we looked at John Locke's account of words. And John Locke, as we saw, took a more empiricist stance toward the philosophy of language. And on his view, we could never really understand what is outside of our own minds. But in this discussion, we're going to see another philosopher who took a more rationalistic view. Frege makes a distinction between ideas and thoughts, which he believes might actually solve this problem that Locke had. We can best begin to understand language by conceiving of it as involving two important worlds. In the first world of sensory impression, what we have are wishes, sensations, feelings, moods, inclinations, and decisions. What we do is collect all of the above under the rubric of ideas and attempt to determine whether they would ever be part of an outer world. The outer world is simply the world outside of all of these things. That is, the world of rocks and trees, birds, things that exist independently of any of our ideas about them. The problem is that without supplementing this basic thesis with some other arguments, it becomes very implausible. So Frege considered three different possibilities that might help to ground this thesis. The first is that ideas cannot be touched, smelled, tasted, or heard. As Frege says, if you go for a walk with a friend and you spot a green field, you both have visual impressions of that field. However, you clearly do not have the same visual impression of the field, and the proof of it is that when you ask each other what each of you saw, while you might each describe being in the same green field, you'll describe different things. So you may describe, for example, a tree that you thought was particularly tall, while your friend may have seen other things, such as a squirrel darting around. While you may have seen these things, each of your brains focused on different sensory impressions. So these are what we understand as ideas. The second observation is that ideas are had and they belong to the content of our consciousness. Because pain, moods, and wishes are never free-floating in the outer world, we can sharply distinguish them from the outer world in a principled manner. Everywhere that they occur, we see that they occur in individual people. The inner world presupposes the person whose inner world it is. This in turn leads us to three. In order to even make sense of an idea, we have to say that someone had an idea of X or Y. Ideas do not exist independently of our thoughts, whereas trees and green fields do exist independently of our thoughts. Three is crucial because it establishes some agreement between Locke and Frege on the question of sense impressions. However, where Frege importantly differs from Locke is the Lockean claim is that our words only ever pick out the contents of our ideas. Locke mistakenly thought, says Frege, that if our words only ever represent our sense impressions, therefore they do not pick out the features of reality. However, on Frege, there still is a distinction between sense impressions and reality, and it does not follow that we cannot map out the contents of our words onto reality. From what came before, we get to number 4, which is that every idea has only one bearer, and no two people ever have the same idea. If the situation were otherwise, then we would essentially be saying that ideas exist independently of everyone. But if this were so, we could not make sense of the statement that, quote-unquote, a lime tree is my idea. The statement would not make sense because while we can both touch the lime tree and taste the limes from the lime tree, we can also say that the lime tree has its own properties and that those properties are not actually the contents solely of our own minds. Frege uses the example of the Pythagorean theorem to clinch the point. What we see in this case is that the Pythagorean theorem cannot be said to be Frege's idea, and yet at the same time we can say that Frege can recognize the Pythagorean theorem as a true proposition. Why say this? The reason why we cannot say that the Pythagorean theorem is mine or yours, etc., is that such concerns the issue of truth and falsity. The Pythagorean theorem pertains to a truth claim, so it cannot be merely within the sphere of Frege's consciousness. It is chiefly concerned with claims that occur outside of our minds, as well as outside of the minds of others. But, and this is the important part, if this is true, then we must admit that A, ideas are not the same as thoughts, and B, thoughts do not require a bearer in the same way that ideas require a bearer. This then leads us to the plausible conclusion that thoughts, such as the Pythagorean theorem, are neither sense impressions in the inner world of ideas, nor are they properties of the outer world. Instead, they belong to what Frege calls the third realm, which is the realm of thought. Thus, the thought, which we express in the Pythagorean, is timelessly true, independently of whether anyone takes it to be true. It needs no bearer. There are several objections that could be raised to Frege's account here. The first objection is a weak objection that comes from a skeptical worry. The objection is that Frege assumes that while persons have different ideas, they do indeed see the same objects. But what if life is just a sort of a dream? Frege anticipates this as a possible move that the skeptic might make against him. It might be the case that Frege has only really dreamed all the things that he has perceived with his sensory impressions. And if so, we would have reason to doubt that there is an external outer world in the first place. Maybe I see things, but you do not see the same things that I see. Frege gives the following as a reply to the skeptic, which is that if the skeptic were correct, it would actually show that the objection is self-defeating. Here's why. If we entertain this objection, we begin to see that it's ridiculous, because if Frege can only be aware of ideas, then the critic himself would not be an object of Frege's awareness, which would mean that there would be no reason why Frege would think that the critic would exist in the first place. There would indeed be no reason to think that we could be aware of trees or seashells in such a way that would ever distinguish principally between the two. What's worse is that if a seashell were just quote-unquote my idea, then the seashell would have no physical weight. But it does have physical weight. So either one, the objection that Frege's idea can only be the awareness of his own consciousness is false, or two, all of Frege's knowledge and perception are limited to the range of his own ideas or consciousness. Either way, the objection looks less plausible when we think about its implications. So how can Frege claim that pain, which is in his consciousness, is something other than idea? In other words, how can Frege claim that pain can be a thought? In reply, Frege says the following: we can resolve the paradox by observing that I can have an idea of my pain without thereby saying that my idea is identical to pain. So according to Frege, we are the bearers of ideas, and it may very well be the case that each of us bears our own idea of pain in our own head. But what really matters is that we can detect pain, and that pain is not merely inside of our own heads. We can establish this by considering the case of a doctor and an invalid. The doctor is in attendance to the person who is in pain, but we have confirmation of the fact that the pain exists outside of the invalid himself, because the doctor can try to relieve the pain by giving the invalid an aesthetic. What's more, we can really drive home the point by considering the case of several doctors. Now, in the last case, it's the invalid who bears the pain, and we have our doctor who tries to remove the pain with the aesthetic. In turn, that doctor may consult with yet another doctor who draws on the wisdom of the second doctor. Their respective ideas of the pain are the products of their consciousness, but this is not merely because they themselves bear the ideas of pain. There actually is a thought of pain that each of the doctors relates to, and it is that reconciles the different ideas of pain that they have. From this, Frege says we can make the following kind of argument. Premise one is that as the bearers of ideas, we ourselves are not merely ideas. Premise two is that from history, science, and religion, we find that we have good reasons to think that the probability that other people exist is very high, given that the progress and improvement in these disciplines is always occurring. Premise three is that if it were the case that we were merely ideas, then we could not account for these improvements. The conclusion is that other people themselves are not merely ideas, rather other people are the bearers of ideas as much as I myself, and being independent of me, those other people are able to make sense of the outer world and are able to make the kinds of breakthroughs in human civilization that we see. By now, it should be clear that there is a significant distinction for Frege between ideas, which are sense impressions, and thoughts, which are approximate truths. Now, what does it take for something like a thought to actually be true? The work of science does not consist in creation of ideas, but rather in the discovery of true thoughts, and that is how we advance the scientific disciplines. This, in turn, leads to the idea that the truth of a thought is timeless. Frege notes that he expects more opposition from those of an empiricist bent, for empiricists say that the sole source of knowledge is our sensory impressions, and clearly Frege's claim that thought does not belong strictly to the inner world will not sit well with them, since impressions, after all, are necessary constituents of the inner world. Yet empiricism itself is very questionable, as no two people ever have the same ideas. It cannot be the case that sense impressions constitute the whole of our knowledge. Our visual impressions are not enough to ground reality of what we see, and few would assert otherwise. Typically, at most, the empiricist says that such is at least the most reliable method we have for the discovery of truth, although it is, of course, unsatisfactory. The third objection that Frege deals with is potential detractors who say that it can't be that some thoughts are approximately true. After all, we can imagine a tree that is green today, but which loses its leaves in the fall. So this shows that our language only ever picks out temporal claims, which is in line with what Locke asserted. We can say, for instance, this tree is covered with green leaves, but such obviously does not hold throughout the passage of time. In response, Frege wishes to draw our attention to the truth conditions of any given statement. We cannot just look at words themselves. Without such, we have a complete sentence, but we do not have a complete thought. In other words, there's a difference between the statement, such and such is true at a particular time, versus the statement that such is true regardless of time that may pass. Truth is preserved in both instances where the thought is complete. There is, according to Frege, a crucial distinction that we must make between something's having essential properties on the one hand and something having inessential properties on the other. When we talk about the leaves of the tree changing or even falling off, we talk about the inessential properties that the tree has. But when we make a statement such as the tree is green, we are making a statement that could be true across time in the sense that other people in various historical time periods can recognize that the statement is true, even if the leaves on a physical given tree might indeed fall off or turn a different color. This again helps to show the important distinction between thoughts and ideas in Frege's philosophy. Not surprisingly, just as there's a great deal of debate about John Locke's account of words, there is also a great deal of debate about Frege's general philosophy of language and his distinction between ideas and thoughts. We'll examine some of these other debates in the philosophy of language the next time. Until then, please continue to seek truth and to pursue the examined life.